All right, this is the second half of Standard 8.6. This is the last of the videos. So if you miss me after this, you're going to have to go back and start over with the first one. Um, anyway, so we're left off talking about the Middle East, and we talked about how we won in the Middle East. The problem is that after the Persian Gulf War, we decided it's a good idea to leave some troops in Saudi Arabia, which turns out to be a pretty controversial decision because Saudi Arabia is home to both Mecca and Medina, which are the two holiest cities in Islam. Imagine if an Islamic country decided to park its military right outside of the Vatican. I think even if you're not Catholic, I think you understand why that would cause some concern among a lot of folks in the world. Well, that's how some of the how some Muslims felt. In particular, some of the more fanatic fundamentalist Muslim organizations such as Al-Qaeda, which is why Osama bin Laden is over there on the side. These extremist groups, many of them started banding together into larger groups, and they decided they needed a terrorist arm of their religious group. So the most famous of these is the Taliban, which comes out as a combination of the Mujahideen I mentioned in Afghanistan and a couple other groups. And they decide that they're going to form a terrorist wing called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, of course, is most famous because they're the ones who carried out the attacks on September 11th in the World Trade Center and in the Pentagon. So as a result of this, the United States says we have to stop this. So the Taliban is largely operating out of Afghanistan. We have to go into Afghanistan. We have to stop this kind of thing from happening again. Afghanistan, it seems, under the control of a very kind of radical group, allowed Al-Qaeda to form there and do all kinds of, practice and, activities to prepare for attacks like this. And so we go in there. We put our troops in there. Around the same time, we believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and so we invade them as well. Over here, this is from Shock and Awe. In 2003, when we move into Iraq, we first bomb the city, and it's televised. I remember watching this on television and just watching Baghdad, government buildings and military buildings, just being bombed for hours on end. You can watch this on YouTube. Now, we go in there, and during that entire time that we're in Iraq, we never find weapons of mass destruction, which leads to all kinds of interesting issues. Should we have gone in there in the first place is one of the big questions that comes out of that. This time around, we actually do find we do get Saddam Hussein. We arrest him, we hand him over to the Iraqi people, and they hang him for crimes that he committed against his own people. This is kind of old information, so I'm not actually sure where we are, but these numbers are greatly reduced. When the standards were written, we still had troops, large numbers of troops in Afghanistan and some in Iraq, and we were working to help them develop democracy. It's been a tough road on in both countries to make that happen. And largely we've basically said, well, these countries, we've put a lot of effort into them, we're going to pull out, and what remains is what remains. So we're sort of friendly with at least the Afghan government, and in theory the Iraqi government, but they're weak and there's a lot of infighting that happens there. So there's this thing that seemed at the time like it was going to be a huge deal. In 2011, there was the Arab Spring. What happens in the Arab Spring is that you've got a number of young people who have smartphones, and they get apps like Twitter. And on Twitter, they start posting things like, hey, really frustrated with the government. And the response they get helps them understand that they're not alone in that. And so they start organizing protests. They say things like, meet me out in front of the presidential palace for a protest, and it gets retweeted and retweeted and retweeted. And what they think is going to be a protest with maybe 200 people has 10,000 people that show up to protest. This is called the Arab Spring. It seems like it's a new beginning in the Middle East. Now what happens is that many of these countries, because it's not just Egypt, it starts in Egypt, it spreads throughout the Middle East, many of these countries do have democratic elections, but they elect people who are not significantly friendlier to the Middle East to the United States or American policies. So it seemed like, man, this was going to be a new beginning, and it kind of has not been. I would not be surprised to see if this disappears in future versions of the social studies standards because of the lack of long-term effect. Well, during Bill Clinton and Obama's administration, they looked at this issue of Israel that we've been talking about sort of in the background all through this lesson. And both of them say, we need to create a new Palestinian state alongside the Israeli state. We call this the two-state solution. So here the orange would be the Jewish portion of Israel, and the yellow would be Palestine. This has not been extremely successful. Neither side wants it. Both of them believe that God has given them this land. It's their birthright. And so there continues to be strife here. There's one other country. I know this is an old picture. Forgive me for that. One other country we have an issue with, and that is Iran. We still have very strained relations with Iran because they've been developing nuclear capabilities, and we don't want that to happen. And so there have been a number of attempts at talks, and there's actually a peace treaty that exists, although Trump has talked many times of pulling out of this treaty because he believes that Iran is not holding up their end of the deal, and they are pursuing nuclear capabilities. So that's where we are, and that's kind of an unsatisfying place to end, to be honest. But we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what is going to be history tomorrow. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions about anything in this content, please email me or come see me. Hopefully you are totally ready for the EOC at this point. Let me know.